Uh, this is a very interesting chart, I think. The desire for change, because the top line that you're seeing here, this gray line, is definitely wanting change. 43% of the electorate, about 43% of the electorate, definitely wants change, right? While simultaneously, high levels are also approving of the government. So it's this kind of contrarian, contradictory message that's going out, where Canadians are saying, yeah, we generally approve of how the government has functioned, but I think we could stand a change, right? This is what makes Canadian elections so skittish, right? Is because I think Canadians are generally answering these questions honestly, and they're generally trying to speak from their heart, right? And they're also trying to be somewhat considerate and polite about the difficulty, especially of this last election cycle. The pandemic has been a difficult time. And it's interesting because most Canadians are not using the pandemic as a crutch. They're not using the pandemic to sway their vote. That they're looking to the future. They're more interested in climate change. They're more interested in the economy. They're more interested in housing, things like this, than they are to turn around, pat the Liberals on the back, and say, good job in the pandemic, so here's your next government, right? If you take a look at the white line here, change not important, you're seeing a dramatic downtick very sharply from where it was sort of sitting between 26 and 29%. Suddenly it's down at 23%. At the same time that the need for change is on the uptick. And then the red line here is definitely re-elect, floating at about 20%. So you've got 20% support amongst Canadians for the Liberals to just definitely re-elect. And that's just, I think that's probably going to hold out. That it's unlikely the Liberals will fall any farther down than that line, which is already fairly low, if you ask me. Only 20%, whereas the Liberal intention to vote is higher than that. Tells me that Trudeau's support is soft. Trudeau has soft support going into this election, which is why he's calling a snap election in sort of the brief lull that we have over this pandemic, in the hopes that this crisis will galvanize the populace to re-elect and possibly give the Liberals the majority that they're looking for. And it's that elusive majority that the Liberals are really striking for, and the capitalist class is striking for. Because if a Liberal majority is to come in, then it's extremely unlikely that any reform will happen, extremely unlikely that there will be taxation on the wealthy, extremely unlikely that we'll get an increase in social services, things like a basic income, things that are necessary to move forward with climate change. You can expect 4 more years of delay on the climate change issue. You can expect an austerian government that's going to raise taxes on the middle class such that it exists while cutting services. That the Liberals will act in many ways like a conservative government because they have to, quote-unquote, pay for the pandemic. And the way that they are going to do that is by increasing the burden on the majority of the populace while letting the wealthy off the hook because they're Liberals, and that's what they do. And so, the impression of Justin Trudeau, he's about equal, positive and negative. About 40% of people think that they've got a positive view of Justin Trudeau. About 40% have a negative view of Justin Trudeau. And then impressions of Jagmeet Singh, this is very interesting. I think that this is a very fascinating poll about Jagmeet Singh. That his favorability is about 40%, which is upticked recently, right? He was floating up at about 30%, and then just swelled up over the last 6 months to about 40%. So he has about the same favorability as Justin Trudeau does at the moment. But his negativity, the negative view that people have, is significantly lower. That he only has a negative view of about 25%. And that has remained pretty consistent. That if you had a negative view of Jagmeet Singh, you've probably maintained that. whereas the positive view was always fairly high and has upticked recently. Putting him at Justin Trudeau has what is a net score of -1. -1. So positive minus negative equals -1. Whereas Jagmeet Singh is sitting at +16. So people have a very favorable view of Jagmeet Singh, which I think is going to translate into them really listening and hearing what he has to say. And hopefully that translates at the ballot box. And of course, Aaron O'Toole, you've got to talk about him. Almost an inverse of Jagmeet Singh, right? His favorability, 22%. His negative view, 40%, giving him a net score of -19. So he's almost the inverse of Jagmeet Singh. Like, literally, the mood of the populace is, boo old white supremacist man. Hey, dude with turban, interesting, let's go. But interestingly, right, all of that said, how would you vote tomorrow, right? Liberals are sitting at 37%. That's within striking distance for a majority government, right? The Conservatives are down at about 28%, which is a disaster for them going into this election. That any chance that they have about forming government or any of that kind of stuff seems extremely unlikely, considering that they had a pretty hardline floor to begin with, and that itself has eroded. And of course, the erosion of the Conservative Party, they could erode into the newly formed Maverick Group or the People's Party, but there's a pretty high level chance that the people who are eroding away from the Conservatives are going to go towards the Liberals. That's the pendulum swing that happens in Canada. So as people siphon off of the Conservatives, they're most likely to end up in the Liberals. So a declining Conservative Party doesn't necessarily help from the leftist communist perspective, because a Liberal government is just as bad as a Conservative government as far as I'm concerned. The NDP, on the other hand, have been enjoying a kind of steady increase over time, right? While the Conservatives have been in kind of a steady decline, the NDP rather, have been in a steady, subtle incline. Last election we had, the Jagmeet Singh and the NDP, right about in the last few weeks of the election, experienced a jump in the polls by about 5 points. Now, what that means is if they were to experience a jump of about 5 points in the polls this time, that would put them ahead of the Conservatives in terms of voting intention. And it could also erode away support from the Liberals. Remembering, of course, that the Liberal support is soft. It's not firm. And we've seen this happen before, where the Liberals will jump ship and they will swing towards the NDP. The question is now the time? And my perspective, of course, is simply that it's Jagmeet's race to win, if you ask me. So, and of course they do some polling on like the Maverick Party and all of this. So, preferred election outcome. This is a very important graph, because it's one thing to sort of like, oh, what do I vote and all that kind of, but what would you like to see? So the majority of people actually do want to see a Liberal majority. 36% of the populace wants to see a Liberal majority, which I can't stress enough is a complete disaster for Canada. It means 4 more years of inaction on climate change. It means an austerian government that's going to raise taxes on the poorest and the middle-class citizens while cutting services for those same citizens, because they will not raise taxes on the wealthy. They've shown that repeatedly over and over again. It means like things like the CRB, things like the social security nets and things like this that were put in over the pandemic will be eliminated. And if they are elected into a majority position and they need to they need to move forward on some kind of help for people because of the pandemic, those supports will be very meager indeed and very weak, because once the Liberals have a majority, they no longer need to respond to the demands or the insistences that are put on them by the NDP or the Bloc or the Conservatives. Hey, Crouching, how you doing today, bud? Good to see you today. We're just going through some election information here. Great abacus data polling coming through. Unfortunately, the majority of the Canadian populace wants to see a Liberal majority. Now, that is, of course, coupled with the 27% of people who want to see a Liberal minority, right? Then you have 26% saying that they want to see a Conservative majority, and 12% would like to see a Conservative minority. For whatever reason, the NDP are not part of this particular poll. I, for one, would love to see an NDP minority at this stage in the game, but I am rooting for, because I'm realistic, and I'm not going to pretend like the populace is suddenly going to have an awakening, come to Jesus sort of moment. I'm rooting for a Liberal minority. I think at this stage in the game, another minority government of any sort would be extremely preferable than certainly a Liberal majority, which I think would be a complete disaster for Canada and therefore the world. The Liberals have shown that they are arms dealers. They're completely in lockstep with the American imperial machine. The Liberals support Juan Guaido and call him the leader of Venezuela, which is an absurdism. They are supportive of the apartheid regime in Israel. Like, all of the bleak darkness that exists in American empire, the Liberals are fully funding it and fully backing it. They either lack the spine to stand up to the American empire, or they're completely complicit, right? And 36% of the population would like these guys to be your majority rulers. So that's very concerning to me. As a citizen, I would much, much rather another Liberal minority give the NDP more time to sort of coalesce their power, to build their base, to create power structures. But, of course, the Liberals aren't interested in that whatsoever. So we'll see. Things can swing fairly wildly in election seasons. And we've seen it before. We've seen it over and over again. But right now, the Liberals are sitting pretty. They're sitting pretty. They just need to not screw the pooch at this stage in the game. But if we remember, like, crazy news can come out during election seasons. The blackface scandal happened in the middle of an election, right? And political parties hold on to these nuggets to drop them amidst election season. So we'll see what the NDP are going to come up with. We'll see what the Conservatives are going to do, because the Conservatives can also swing this. So that's where we're sitting here. And of course, which party is going to win? Most Canadians think it's going to be Liberal in one way or another. And I honestly think that that's just the safe money. But if you look down the list, 23% sitting down at unsure. Crouching, so sad, we don't even live in a true democracy anymore. They bought and paid for by big corporations. Yeah, it's why it's dangerous to have a single billionaire. You have a single billionaire and they can influence the political system in ways that are completely unhealthy for any kind of democracy, right? And any kind of system generally, right? Just the existence of the billionaire makes it so that you can't really structure your society in rational ways.